Good morning. There we go. I can now see a little bit out there. Okay. I'd like to welcome everybody to the 2023 Summer Lecture Series. My name is Peter Paquette. I'm the current president of OSHER. I want to remind everybody that there are other people who are also in attendance on a live stream who are our members, and that we also have two other sister OLLI programs who are joining us remotely. One is the University of Georgia at Athens, and the other is the University of Massachusetts at Boston. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors. I think you've been seeing some of the screen here. I'd like to thank our platinum sponsor, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation. I'd like to thank our gold sponsors, Caldwell Law Offices, Dartmouth Coach, Kendal at Hanover, Ledyard National Bank, and the Village of White River Junction. And our bronze sponsor for today's session is Commonwealth Financial. I want to discuss a couple of quick housekeeping things that need to get taken care of before we get to our moderator and our speaker. The first is anyone who is attending a OSHER Summer Lecture Series for the first time, I think you all got Q&A cards. I'm assuming you got Q&A cards, please? Yes? Okay, yes, good. All right. When we go to break, if you have a question, if you would fill out your Q&A card with your question, and if you wish to address your name and the town you're from, and you can put them up in a little basket that's right up here at the stage. They will be processed during break and collated for our Q&A afterwards. If you're on live stream, you can submit questions on the chat function, and we will process those during the break and integrate them into the Q&A that follows the presentation. I'd also like to let everybody know that there is a post-lecture discussion in classroom 3A at 1 Court Street, which is just around the corner. It is our main office and classroom space for OSHER at Dartmouth. And now I'd like to welcome the moderator, Pamela Crossley, who is a professor of history at Dartmouth College, and she will introduce today's speaker. Thank you all.
Good morning. Welcome to this really charming venue for this program. I want to just point out briefly that the theme of the series this summer really could not be more appropriate. I'm a historian, so I usually think in terms of this very, very long relationship between the United States and China. But the current relations between the PRC and the United States are at this juncture that is really a kind of counterpoint to the history as a whole. There are so many possibilities now for starting anew in some areas, but then there are so many lingering problems. It's just really, you're probably tired of hearing about the perpetual crisis in U.S.-China relations, but actually this is actually probably a very, very significant moment. So the theme of competitive coexistence couldn't really be more appropriate. And the speaker today couldn't be more appropriate for that, because that phrase is actually something that we associate with him very distinctly. David Shambaugh hasn't always been an academic. He started out, I guess, as a child, associated with the State Department and the National Security Council in the days of Jimmy Carter. So subsequently in academics in the UK and the United States. He's authored 30 books. Well, I mean, that averages out to just a little under one a year. And in the past 3 years has published 4 books with very, very different titles, right? China in the world, where the great powers meet, America and China in Southeast Asia, China's leaders from Mao to now, and East Asia's international relations. So he is currently the Gaston Sigua Professor of Asian Studies, Political Science, and International Relations at George Washington University, where he's also director of the Elliott School for International Relations. Of the China Policy program at the Elliott School, GW. So it's my great pleasure to introduce him for today's talk.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. You can see me, but I'm trying to see you with these bright lights, but I'll grow accustomed to them. But thank you for coming and getting up so early. I am personally and professionally just delighted to be here and to kick off this summer series that will be taking place over the coming weeks on competitive coexistence with China. Can it be maintained? So I think this is really the right way to think about and to frame this very fraught relationship that the United States and China find themselves in at the moment. Competitive coexistence. Can it be maintained? The OSHER organizers kind of anticipated my own personal hope and prediction. In fact, if we can maintain competitive coexistence, I would consider it a success. And I will explain this morning why there are other alternatives. So I think you're in for a really interesting series of very good speakers over the coming weeks. And I welcome those of you here in New Hampshire, but also many of you who are online today. Please do tune in to the subsequent speakers as well. I'd also like just to begin by acknowledging the fact that it's a very distinct honor for me to have been being introduced this morning by Dartmouth's extremely distinguished professor of modern Chinese and global history, Pamela Crossley. And when I say distinguished, I'm not trying to flatter you, Pamela, I really mean it. Pamela has long been one of our country's leading, if not the leading, and path-breaking scholars of Qing Dynasty history, but also global history. And she's contributed enormously to the world's understanding of that last Chinese dynasty and the transition from imperial to the modern era. So great to see you, Pamela, and I'm really honored to be introduced by you. Okay, so just keep track of time here. I'm going to start this morning with a sort of a little thought exercise. When I say that the U.S.-China relationship is fraught, that may be an understatement. If you look at the most recent Pew Research Center polls, one finds that no less than 82% of Americans have a negative and unfavorable perception of China. 82%. That is the highest in history, even higher than after the 1989 so-called Tiananmen massacre. So that's the current Pew findings. And I must say it parallels the perceptions of China across what might be called the global north, Europe and Asia, north of the equator. Views of China south of the equator across the world are more positive, but mixed. very few places, ladies and gentlemen, on the planet today that have an overwhelmingly and singularly positive view of China. And if you look at the changes over time, which you can do, I encourage you to go to the Pew Research Center website, because one of the nice things about it is you can see over a decade and across the world how different publics are viewing China. Anyway, the United States is not an outlier. So that's not the thought exercise. The thought exercise I want to start with is also to be found in that most recent Pew poll, in which there are three different descriptors that how would you characterize. So I'm going to read off to you. I don't want to prejudice you. Raise your hands when I use each one, just to see compared. There's always the harbinger of the United States, and we the rest of us look at this time of year, this political season, we in what new and think. But I'm going to read each of these off. And please raise your hand, and then we'll go to the next of the three, and then the third. And I'm kind of curious to see where this. You would characterize China as a partner. Okay. There are roughly about 10 out of 150. I think, estimate. How many of you would characterize China as an enemy? Fewer, but around 10. Interesting. Third descriptor. How many of you would characterize China as a competitor? 99.9%. So that's why OSHER should be commended on the selection of the summer series about competition. And that's what I'm going to, let me tell you how the American public sees those three terms compared to this audience. So Pew, the last Pew poll shows that only 6% of the American public see China as a partner. 38% see it as an enemy, much higher than this group. I would say 8 to 10% of this group put up their hands. 52% of the American public see China as a competitor. Half of, you might say, of this group. So slightly different, but we know that New Hampshire's nonconformist. So all right. So interesting. And I encourage you to go on the Pew website. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about this morning with you. Competition. U.S.-China competition in different dimensions. I'm going to first discuss kind of conceptually how one might think about, or at least how I think about competition. And then I will walk through a number of different dimensions of U.S.-China competition, and then I'll have some closing observations. But the word competition has really become the most prevalently used term among American foreign policy specialists for characterizing the U.S.-China relationship. Policy journals, Foreign Affairs, and many others are filled with articles on U.S.-China competition. U.S. government officials and documents increasingly use this terminology as well. But it's not new, the term. The reality is also not new. The reality goes back 70 years. But the term was first introduced into the American political lexicon by George W. Bush during his campaign against then President Bill Clinton. Bush was the first to describe China as a strategic competitor in that campaign, 2000, directly contradicting and contrast with the Clinton administration's own depiction of China as a strategic partner, right? Competitor partner, right there, back in 2000. So in some ways, we are still having the same debate 20 years on in this country, but it's evolved, as I will describe. After they entered office, the Bush administration largely dropped the term, even though they used it throughout the campaign. But they dropped it for a way to describe the relationship after they came into office. And then the term went into sort of a 16-year hibernation until strategic competition, again, similar, became the official centerpiece used by the Trump administration in a variety of official documents and speeches. And that, since then till this day, 7 years or so, it has been the most used characterization of the U.S.-China relationship, competition. Now, the Biden administration, for its part, has also adopted competition as its central intellectual and policy organizing construct, albeit with different adjectival modifiers, adjectives before the term competition. President Biden himself, soon after entering office in February 2021, used the term extreme competition to describe the relationship with China. Later that same year, he used the term healthy competition. Little inconsistency there. Mind you, when he used healthy competition, he was actually having a Zoom conversation with the president of China. So it was a little more polite. So, Mr. President, we'd like to have a healthy competition with you. Biden's various officials in his administration, including National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, has used different terms over the last 2 years. He's used intense competition, stiff competition, and responsible competition. So the adjectives change. Competition stays, and Secretary of State Blinken, for his part, he's described the relationship as, quote, competitive when it should be, collaborative where it can be, and adversarial where it must be, unquote. And the Biden administration's official national security strategy, Indo-Pacific strategy, other official documents, they have introduced a kind of new adjective into the lexicon in the last year or so, managed competition, managed competition. And they say, we seek to manage competition with the PRC responsibly. Manage responsibly. That's new, that's not careless words. These are official American documents. Now, for its part, however, Beijing has categorically and publicly rejected this language and the whole concept and the term competition, 竞争 in Chinese. They refuse to use it. Their senior, now just retired foreign policy official, Yang Jiechi, met with Jake Sullivan about a year ago in Zurich, Switzerland, and he told Sullivan in no uncertain terms in front of the press, quote, China opposes defining China-U.S. relations as competitive, unquote. Couldn't be more straightforward. And then he added, the United States should join Beijing in respecting each other's core interests and major concerns, follow the path of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation between the two countries, unquote. So for the Chinese side, that's their language. This is, in some ways, it's a story of dueling narratives between the two governments. Now, most recently, just a couple weeks ago, when Secretary of State Antony Blinken went to Beijing, finally, he met with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping told him in front of the cameras, quote, major country competition does not represent the trend of the times, unquote. So there the Chinese president is on record as shooting down the concept of competition. They don't want to even engage rhetorically with that language. Now, the question is, what does competition really mean when we use it in the context of the U.S.-China relationship? That's why I'm here. That's what I want to talk about this morning as you begin this, 4-week summer series. I think it's important to kind of have some intellectual, step back a little bit and think about the terminology. Now, personally, I think of and describe the relationship in my own writings. Well, I'm perfectly comfortable with the term competition, but I go a little bit further. I have 4 terms. I call the U.S.-China relationship one of indefinite, comprehensive, competitive rivalry. Indefinite, comprehensive, competitive rivalry. It is now primarily a competitive relationship in which the very few existing elements of cooperation are far outstripped by the competitive ones. It's hard to find any cooperation in the relationship today. It's a relationship in which each side seeks to strengthen itself vis-a-vis the other. This is what political scientists call internal balancing. And both sides take actions and counteractions against the other, what political scientists call external balancing. It is comprehensive in that it stretches virtually across all functional issue areas of the relationship, and literally across all geographic regions of the globe. This is a global geostrategic and geoeconomic competition, okay? And even into outer space and cyberspace. And it's become a classic great power rivalry whereby each side increasingly contests the other's presence and influence worldwide. And it exhibits classic reactive and escalatory elements of what political scientists again call the security dilemma. And finally, it is not time-bound and can be expected to last indefinitely into the future. This is not a temporary phenomenon, folks. Get used to it. So that's how I, in very simplistic terms, think of it, those 4 terms. But competition is actually absolutely central to my own thinking. Now, let me also just sort of step back for a minute and note that competition is not intrinsically a negative concept, nor is it intrinsically the opposite of cooperation. Competition in many fields has a much more neutral and even positive connotation. And it is often distinguished from conflict or adversarial relationships. So to be competitive doesn't mean you're an adversary necessarily, or in a conflict. You're in a competition. So competition, is really intrinsic, as I say, in many fields of life, in commerce, in innovation and invention, in media with different outlets competing for subscribers and viewers and readers, in politics. Here in New Hampshire, you're experiencing competition every 4 years, right? In sports, that's the essence of all sports. In education and the so-called intellectual marketplace of ideas, we compete with ideas in the classroom and in the public domain. And in other domains. So competition is not, as I say, inherently negative. It doesn't necessarily have to be, and doesn't have to be necessarily zero-sum. Competition and cooperation can coexist simultaneously. Thus, when we say that the U.S.-China relationship today is primarily competitive, is not to imply that there's no scope for pragmatic cooperation. I wish there was more. But these are not mutually exclusive concepts. Now, competition is not new to the U.S.-China relationship either. It's been embedded in the relationship since the People's Republic of China was born on October 1st, 1949. Really it's been, but it has really advanced or increased after the global financial crisis of 2008-9, I would say. And concomitantly, the areas of cooperation have shrunk over that last 15-year period. So it is an appropriate adjective, or appropriate term, I think, to describe the relationship today. Let's hope that the competition can lead to a kind of coexistence and that can be maintained, as the theme of this series indicates. That should be the goal. If we can, in fact, the two sides find, first of all, sort of an equilibrium, which has never been easy in U.S.-China relationship. If you look at it over the last 70 years, it's been wildly fluctuant. So actually, if you look at the relationship historically, this low point is in fact one of the most steady periods that we've been in for a very long time, the last decade. All right? It's a low point, and it's concerning, and it's dangerous, but it's not wildly fluctuant as the relationship had been in the previous 6 decades. Now, it's very stressed, and I'm going to explain this morning in what ways, but the relationship could get worse, much worse, and it is not impossible. I don't mean to scare you on an early Friday morning, but it's not impossible to imagine a war breaking out between these two powers. I'm not trying to scare you, but we have never been so close to a war with the Chinese since Korea as we are today over Taiwan, potentially. Maybe there are some other scenarios, South China Sea. Other things could happen that could trigger a war. Wars aren't necessarily conscious things that countries go into, make a decision, yes, let's go to war. Accidents can start wars, and if they escalate and are not controlled. So that's why I mentioned the South China Sea. We've had a number of very close calls between American and Chinese aircraft, ships, and submarines, just in recent weeks and months. And thus far, they have not collided since the 2001 collision over the South China Sea, which the Chinese lost a plane and their fighter pilot, and we almost lost our plane and its crew. Anyway, my point is, I'm not trying to scare you, but if we can achieve a competitive coexistence, that will be a measure of substantial success, because things are drifting in a very dangerous direction. Now, the mutual goal, therefore, should be for both sides to deftly manage the multitude of competitive issues that they face, so that the relationship does not, sort of progressively bleed or inadvertently bleed and slide into conflict. Wars start that way. Think 1914. Think other wars. So managing fluid competition is a bit like tending a garden. It requires constant attention and proactive management. It can also kind of be thought of like a sporting match with no end, where each contestant advances and retreats on the field of play, but neither side really wins or loses. I guess kind of the perpetual draw, you might say. Now, but again, if we can find a way to manage the competition, establish an equilibrium where both sides respect the other's so-called core interests, that's Chinese terminology, maybe some guardrails and buffers to this deteriorating and very fraught relationship can be established, and a floor put under it. That's what Secretary of State Blinken's trip to Beijing 2 weeks ago was all about. It's just one step. The American side is trying very, very hard to establish a framework of, as I use these terms, guardrails, off-ramps, buffers, foundations to bound this competition. The American side, at least, really sees the dangers in where we are. Whether the Chinese do or not is unclear, because their system is so opaque, they will not say openly. They won't even use the word competition. It's like turning on a tape recorder for their propaganda, and then the propaganda, win-win cooperation, mutual trust, so on and so forth, turn off the tape recorder. Good grief, that doesn't help. If you can't have a really, you can't speak the same language, use the same terminology, and understand what how the other side sees things, that's dangerous in itself. Okay, So this is another way to think about the relationship today. I tell my students it's like a broken marriage or a very dysfunctional marriage, but one in which divorce is not an option. And there is no counseling or mediation available in this dysfunctional marriage. The two sides cannot walk away from each other and say, oh, well, we tried, you know, good luck to you, hope you can find another partner, you know, let's manage the children, whatever. Sorry, it's probably not the right metaphor, there is, you know, this has to be worked out between the two sides, and that's what both sides are trying to do, I gather, a couple weeks ago in Beijing. So, those are some background thoughts on what competition is. Now let's break the relationship down, or apart, I should say, into different domains and see how competition characterizes each of these five domains. First being domestic politics, second being bureaucratic politics, third being societies, both societies, third being regional affairs in Asia, and finally global affairs. These are five different spheres, you might say, in which the U.S. and China interact, in which the competitive elements are very evident. So let's start with the first, domestic politics. Now, the two countries, this is no secret, have dramatically different political systems and different political ideologies. And I must say right at the beginning, ideology is a major element of this relationship on both sides, and has been for a very long time. Has been ever since the PRC was established in 1949, and the communists came to power. So political differences also, and throughout the Cold War period, or much of the Cold War period. Now, obviously, after Nixon went to China in 1972, ideology and differences in the political systems were put aside temporarily in the interest of pursuing other dimensions of the relationship. So their ideologies fundamentally contributed to the Cold War and to the American policy of containment against China from 1949 to really up to 72 and Nixon's trip. It also led to a variety of covert attempts by the United States to subvert the communist regime on the mainland and to support the nationalist regime that had withdrawn, retreated, been driven off the mainland to Taiwan throughout that period. That was the period of so-called free China versus so-called red China. Some of you in the audience are old enough to remember this era and the role it played in the 1960 presidential campaign. Anyway, it led to, as I say, covert attempts to subvert the PRC regime by the U.S. It led to two hot and very costly wars in Korea and in Vietnam. Why were we in Korea and why were we in Vietnam, folks? Answer, China. Well, obviously Korea, it's to roll back the North Korean aggression. But then the Chinese came in to support their ally, North Korea, and they rolled back the MacArthur and the American forces until the war reached a stalemate and finally an armistice. But the whole Cold War was premised on from the American perspective, premised on the assumption of an expansionist communist China on its periphery. That started in Northeast Asia and Korea, and then it went south to Vietnam and Laos. And that was the rationale used by Lyndon Johnson, not so much President Kennedy, but Johnson for sure, for the American involvement in Vietnam. If Chinese expansionism was not stopped there, it would proceed down the Malay Peninsula, cross maritime Southeast Asia, Australia, and land on the shores of California. You know, some of you are old enough to remember some of this rhetoric from the time, but the point here is that it was precisely the Chinese Communist regime that the United States objected to on political and ideological grounds for all of those decades, and vice versa, as Beijing viewed so-called American monopoly, capitalism, and imperialism as its mortal enemy. Both sides refracted mirror imagery, really, of the other. And so that was the case for 2 decades until Nixon and Mao met in 1972. And as I say, both sides put the political differences aside to pursue strategic interests, strategic expediency of countering the Soviet Union. They found common cause in that and worked well together towards that end until the mid-1980s, I would say. And during the 1980s, of course, China was moving into its so-called period of reform and opening, Gai Ge Yu Kai Fan, that Deng Xiaoping and his colleagues initiated. That was viewed very positively by the American public and the American government, and the perceptions of China in the American public. Go back and look at the Pew polls from those years. Just, you know, became much more positive because China was moving into a more liberal, quote, capitalist, unquote, direction. Now, it wasn't becoming capitalist, but that's what Americans were led to believe, and to a certain extent was actually taking place on the mainland. This tapped into a very long-standing impulse in the American public, what I call the missionary impulse, to transform China. If you want to look at one element that is persistent in the American relationship with China from 1784, when it began, right through to today, what is it? The missionary impulse to transform China. Americans have always wanted to change China. It's just a question of the intensity of that desire. This predates communism. The United States has had a transformative missionary impulse to transform China politically, socially, in terms of religion, and civil society, economically, militarily, all education and professional, different professions, all dimensions. That is the singular thing that characterizes the American approach to China over 2+ centuries. Whether that's appropriate or not is another question, and correct or not is another question. That's actually the next book I'm beginning to write. But the problems in the U.S.-China relationship, I would observe, and I'm going to argue in this book, have been partially the result of the American attempt to transpose or impose its own expectations on China for over 2 centuries. And then the Chinese don't meet the expectations. And then there's disenchantment and alienation, and the relationship becomes sort of dysfunctional and deteriorates until both sides kind of get a grip and realize that it's better to kind of try and find an equilibrium than drift into a conflict. There are, historians have counted 6 or 7 such cycles in the U.S.-China relationship over the last 2 centuries. Warren Cohen, if you're wondering, Pamela, who I'm speaking of. The 80s, Deng Xiaoping, new reforms, the Americans just unleashed this sort of gene that had been dormant in the American public for the previous 2 decades during the Cold War. Boy, the Americans just snapped right back. Yes, we want to transform China. Let's work with them, help them transform themselves in a more liberal direction. After all, that's what it was all about. Liberalism, folks, liberalism with a capital L. So that was fine until June 4th, 1989. boom, Tiananmen Massacre, or so-called Tiananmen Massacre. That just dramatically affected the relationship in a very negative way, sent it into another period, another hiatus period of alienation and name-calling and dysfunction until the mid-90s, when the two sides sort of put Humpty Dumpty back together again, at least in a kind of functional fashion. They didn't fall back in love with each other as they were in the 80s, but it was a kind of functional, practical cooperation that was established under Jiang Zemin, was the Chinese leader then, followed by Hu Jintao. So that lasted, I would argue, until the global financial crisis, or the aftermath of the global financial crisis, just before, but certainly after Xi Jinping, China's current leader, came to power in 2012. Actually, I was living in Beijing in 2009-10 as a Fulbright scholar. Professor Lind and I first met there. And you could feel the atmosphere changing in China as a result of the global financial crisis. And the former respect China had for the United States, even admiration, just disappeared. Now America was seen, was condescended to, looked down on. The Chinese were just, they didn't have much use. Well, they had use, practical use, but they didn't have broader philosophical use in the relationship. So from then on, then Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012. That's now 13 years ago, which is, you know, been a period of a lot of things, but for the U.S.-China relationship, it's been downhill. And there's a direct correlation, I would argue, between Xi Jinping and the deterioration of the relationship. All the things that he has been doing internally in China, externally in the region, which I'll get to here momentarily, and globally, are not at all they're in American interest. They're very contra-American interest. So, for their part, the Chinese Communist Party, as I say, they've long viewed the United States as interventionist in their own, or subversive is the better term, not interventionist, but subversive of their own political system. Way back in the 1950s, John Foster Dulles first used the term peaceful evolution to describe what American policy towards China should be, to peacefully evolve the communist system into a non-communist system. That was 1956, I think. So from then on, the Chinese Communist Party said, right, these Americans, they're out to get us. And they will use every method possible to undermine and subvert our rule. And you know what? They're not wrong. I think they overstated it, but in more recent years, the Chinese Communist Party has perceived a wide variety of subversive U.S. mechanisms to try and achieve the subversion of their system. American foundations, NGOs, American media, educational exchanges, religious activists, and covert intelligence methods, they believe, have all been used to try and subvert their political system. So then after the collapse of the East European Communist Party states and then the Soviet Union itself in 1991, the Chinese attributed those collapses, particularly the Soviet collapse, to what? To American subversion, what they call color revolutions. So they see themselves as on the receiving end of decades of American attempts to contain, surround, undermine, subvert, pressure. They basically believe the U.S. has never been content with their regime, all the way back to 1949. I'm not passing judgment on that, but that's their belief. And there are many indicators of it. Xi Jinping himself is Exhibit A, you know. He frequently uses the word struggle. We have to douzheng, or fundou, against the Western hostile forces, he calls it, and peaceful evolution. And most recently, he said the United States is trying to contain, encircle, and suppress China. Three things. So the point is here, this first of the 5 variables, and I've got to get moving through the others, is that the differing political systems and ideologies have long been, but are even more now, a significant variable in this sphere, and competition between the two powers. And it's not likely to recede unless the Chinese Communist regime reverts to a more soft, I would call it, form of Leninist rule, as we saw under Deng Xiaoping, under Jiang Zemin, under Hu Jintao, but not under Xi Jinping. So it's not the communist regime, it's the direction of the regime. Believe me, China went through 3 decades of, not such hard authoritarianism, or what I would not describe China as hard authoritarian. I call it neo-totalitarian system. We can get into that in the question and answer period if you're interested. And these are distinctions, but the point is that China's political system is absolutely at the core problem. I believe it's been always the core problem for the United States. Well, this is a two-way relationship, so they've got their agency in this discussion too. But I think it's really returned. I mean, here we have the Biden administration using, what do they call it, democracies versus autocracies as their central framing for foreign affairs. Well, Exhibit A, Putin. Exhibit B, China, maybe the other way around, as far as the Biden administration is concerned. So if the Americans aren't ideological today under the Biden administration, excuse me, we are. If you were to ask me, should we be? I would say absolutely we should be. We should not delude ourselves about the nature of that regime under Xi Jinping. Now, second sphere, somewhat related but somewhat distinct, bureaucratic competition. Now, this has to do with the bureaucratic actors in the 2 national governments and what you might call their institutional missions. All bureaucracies have what sociologists and political scientists call missions, right? As I say, from 49 to 72, there were no interactions between our 2 national governments, none. But by default, both governments had negative bureaucratic missions against the other. The other was seen as an adversary and had to be countered and blunted and blocked, particularly on the Chinese side, but also on the American side. So the propaganda organs of China and the U.S. Information Agency hurled invective at each other in the airwaves. Voice of America dueled with Radio Peking. The respective intelligence agencies monitored each other from afar and tried to smuggle spies into each other's societies. CIA, as I said, ran a variety of covert action programs in several parts of China. American U-2 surveillance planes flew over China until a couple of them were shot down. The Departments of Treasury and Commerce on the economic side, our American economic bureaucracies were all oriented against China, enforcing a trade embargo and export controls against China for 2 decades, while the Chinese counterparts blocked American goods from seeping in from Hong Kong or elsewhere. The U.S. military deployed forces all along China's eastern frontier while maintaining a presence on Taiwan until 1979. There were no student exchanges, no academic educational exchanges, no cultural exchanges. So the departments in both governments that would have been responsible for these kinds of things had nothing to do, really, by default. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing and the U.S. State Department, they had no contact, save outside one occasional meeting in Warsaw, Poland. So the bureaucracies either had no mission or they had a negative adversarial mission against their counterparts. And this is what the Cold War meant in practical bureaucratic terms. Now, the opening, 72, Nixon-Mao opening, offered the opportunity to forge first initial contacts between the 2 bureaucracies and then deeper interactions and hopefully cooperation between the 2 national bureaucracies and to turn these adversarial bureaucratic missions into more positive cooperative missions. That was the strategy, at least of the Carter administration, in which I served, and the person I served under, former Professor Michael Oxenberg. It was his brainchild. Oxenberg was a scholar of bureaucratic politics, Chinese bureaucratic politics and American bureaucratic politics, and he wanted to move the entire American federal bureaucracy from an adversarial set of missions to a more cooperative set of missions. And he had his plan for how to try and move the Chinese bureaucracy at the same time. So this has roots. When we talk about the normalization of U.S.-China relations in 1979, that's what normalization means in real terms, between institutions and societies. Well, Oxenberg also said, well, we want to open our two societies to each other, because eventually he understood something I think his boss, Zbigniew Brzezinski, didn't quite fully understand, that the Soviet Union would someday not be enough to sustain U.S.-China cooperation. And when that day came, the U.S.-China relationship had to have a deeper foundation on which to stand. The Soviet Union was a temporary, dangerous, but it was a tactical, episodic phenomenon. Oxenberg argued, look, we've got to build this relationship out institutionally between our societies in all the ways possible to build interdependence and therefore anchor it and give it long-term sustainability. That's what the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s were all about in our relationship. And I was told I had an hour. That gives me 15 minutes left. I started at 10 past. Sorry, I don't want to rush through this. May eat into your coffee break a little bit, but I think it's important to walk through. So that was what the relationship was doing up until the last decade. What we are now in the process of witnessing is exactly the reverse process, where the two bureaucracies are decoupling, returning to their former adversarial, negative relations against the other, or not having missions. Some of them, the memorandums of understanding between the two sides have just lapsed. But on the American side, the Justice Department, the FBI have been involved in extensive counterintelligence investigations of Chinese espionage and so-called influence operations in the United States. Congress has certainly been playing an active role in this process by passing multiple acts of legislation. The Department of Education, National Institutes of Health, and other funding agencies have stepped up reporting requirements of American universities who have either Chinese scholars in them or are working with institutions in China. Institutions you wouldn't think play a role in U.S.-China relations. The FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, now is more closely policing the operations of Chinese radio and television organs inside the United States. The State Department is policing Chinese print and social media inside the United States. The Defense Department has curtailed a wide range of interactions that it formerly undertook with the People's Liberation Army. NASA, National Aeronautics Space Communication, used to have interactions with Chinese NASA, no more. Even some quiet work between our nuclear laboratories has been cut off. We don't even share meteorological and weather data with each other anymore. The Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta and the Chinese Center used to have quite positive interactions until COVID. I mean, we all know that story. The Treasury Department is monitoring and blocking Chinese investments into the United States and is about to block American outbound investments to China. So this is what you might call, this is the decoupling, the bureaucratic decoupling of the relationship. On the Chinese side, they too are decoupling. What they are doing is securitizing relations with America, 安全化 in Chinese. Everything is now being securitized, and how the Chinese regime views their own national security. They have 16 categories of national security. I won't take the time to go in them, but everything that China does with a foreign actor, particularly the United States of America, must pass this proverbial subversion test. And particularly, there have been a series of laws passed in recent years. The Foreign NGO Law, the National Security Law, which has just been revised in a very draconian form a couple weeks ago. The Cybersecurity Law, the National Intelligence Law of 2017. These have all sent shivers through the foreign community in China. The Chinese Communist regime is really paranoid. It's the only word for it, about their own political longevity. And they see the Americans in particular as just continuing what the Americans have been trying to do, they think, for 70 years, subvert them. I'm not saying we are, but this is what competition looks like bureaucratically. Okay, try and move this along. Intersocietal competition, the third sector, third domain. So I say Oxenberg and the Carter administration and the Reagan administration, all subsequent administrations saw this as fundamental to the U.S.-China relationship. You know, forge interdependence. The more, the better. Tens of millions of Chinese students have studied in the United States. Millions have immigrated and become naturalized American citizens to our benefit as a country. Pre-COVID, 10,000 Americans and Chinese traveled across the Pacific each day to the other country, tourists and other business people. We had a whole series of sister state, sister province, sister city relationships at the societal level, universities, to be sure, all established their own partnerships with their counterparts. All of this is still in, well, it's not all still in place. It too is unraveling. And competition has come into this sphere. It's come into the media sphere. There were tit-for-tat expulsions by both governments just a couple of years ago. The Chinese journalists in this country, which number close, well, at that time, numbered 425 in the United States, were forced to register under the Foreign Agent Registration Act, FARA, as agents of the Chinese, of a foreign state. They're not just journalists. Indeed, many of them are doing things other than journalism. Chinese responded by expelling a number of American journalists, which have never been large to begin with. We're down to, depends how you count it, but around 25 American journalists in China today. 25. The Chinese still have about 350 in this country. That's not exactly reciprocal. But more journalists is better than no journalists. Okay, so the point is that at the societal level, and suspicions have entered into it, and suspicions of political subversion in both directions, not just what I've described about China being suspicious about American attempts to subvert them. We have become suspicious of Chinese attempts to subvert our political system. And folks, I'm here to tell you this is not fake news. Something called influence operations. 影响作动, undertaken by the China's United Front Department, China's Ministry of State Security, China's International Department, media departments, and other organs of the Chinese Communist Party state are all active, very active, around the world. By the way, we are no different. This is a global phenomenon. Influence operations, United Front work, but they're very active in this country, and it's a problem. FBI Director Wray says that there are, at present, 2,000 active open cases of counterespionage against China that the FBI is undertaking. And a new one is opened every 36 hours, he argues. So this is going on in both directions. Then we turn quickly to the Asian regional competition. Well, Xi Jinping, just on the societal part to finish, Xi Jinping's various laws have just really shrunk the number of actors American actors in China. You know how many students, American students there are in China today? 350. Think about that. You know how many Chinese students are in this country? 170,000. Yeah, that's not reciprocal. How many scholars are doing research in China today, American scholars? I don't know a single one, not one. Why? Because the research environment is so hostile and so dangerous with this new counter-espionage law, you can be picked up willy-nilly and detained for going to a library or having a conversation with another scholar. Just normal stuff that Professor Crossley and I and Lind and others have done in China for decades. Can't do it today without a very real risk of arrest and detention. So this is not a warm and fuzzy government we're dealing with, folks. And tourism has also truncated, so on and so forth. So the societal sphere, just like other spheres, rolled back. Asian regional competition, that has long been an arena for the U.S. and China to contest and compete with each other. The Chinese, for their part, have never been happy with the 5 American alliances in the region. Our military presence throughout the region, our intelligence gathering near China, all along their coast. Can't say I blame them. So as the United States has pursued its so-called Indo-Pacific strategies in the last 2 administrations and have rejuvenated, strengthened our alliances and partnerships with countries in the region, the Chinese are getting even more concerned. I'm not going to use the word paranoid there. They're paranoid domestically, but they're concerned about their regional environment. They see the Americans returning to a containment strategy. Xi Jinping said it clearly: contain, encircle, suppress. That's what you Americans are trying to do to us. So, and then there's Taiwan, which I think we'll probably have to leave for the discussion period. It's so complicated, but it's it's been the Chinese call it the core of the core interests of theirs. It's been front and center in the tensions between the 2 countries for decades, but boy, it's very concerning at the moment. Militaries. The Chinese military is a different military than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Chinese Navy, if you weren't aware, is now the largest in the world. I hate to break the news to you folks. As Americans, they have 350 surface combatants. We have 270. And guess what? All of theirs are deployed right in the Western Pacific. Ours are spread worldwide. So the military balance, whether it's naval, whether they're nuclear dimensions, the Chinese are quadrupling their nuclear missiles and delivery systems. You can look at a number of other military. In fact, next week's session in this series is all about the military dimension. So I'll leave it to the speakers next week to go into all this. But there's serious security competition going on throughout all of Asia. That includes Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, Australasia, and increasingly South Asia, the Indian Ocean. And the last area, just to flag, is global. The U.S.-China competition has now gone global. About 10 years ago, I published a book by that title, China Goes Global. At that time, China was just going global. And as it did so, it was just beginning to bump up against long-standing American presence and interests in various parts of the world, namely Latin America, namely the Middle East, namely Europe, places, and namely the Western Pacific, where the United States has been since the Second World War, but they hadn't been. Well, they are now. And so just by their sheer presence, economic presence, United Front operations, intelligence presence, military presence, this is very reminiscent of Cold War 1.0, when the Soviet Union and the United States were shadowing each other around the planet. Okay, so the global competition also extends to multilateral international institutions and what's known as global governance. We have two very different views of how the international system should operate. One is a liberal view, one is an illiberal view. And they are increasingly apparent. In other words, that our liberal view has long been apparent. The Chinese illiberal view has only become more apparent. They used to do pretty well to kind of hide their desires to really change the international institutional order. Now they are no longer hiding and biting and waiting. They are undermining and trying to change actively the institutions that have undergirded the international relations since the Second World War. Okay, so that's the last domain. Let me just close on the point, on the theme of managing competition. I like that term. That's actually, I think I should probably give credit, although he and I argue over who said it first in print. Kevin Rudd, former Australian Prime Minister, now Australian Ambassador to the United States. He published a really good book that I commend to all of you called The Avoidable War last year. And his whole argument is that war is avoidable, that both countries have agency. We can control this downward spiral. We can arrest it. We can lay some guardrails, some buffers, some foundation stones, and we can thereby manage the competition. I fully agree with him. I think I used the term a couple years before he did, but I don't care. We're on the same page, Kevin and I, and I think that's the way to think about competition. So a lot of hard work needs to be done. First, you have to accept competition. Both sides have to accept the competitive nature of the relationship as a reality, and then work very hard on constructing, as I say, different mechanisms that might bound and stabilize the competition. And here, I think, whether or not you believe, or we would argue, that we are in Cold War 2.0 now between the U.S. and China or not, my point is that I think Cold War 1.0 offers a number of useful lessons and tools for both sides to draw on. You remember the détente period between the U.S. and the Soviet Union? We didn't stop being competitors with the Soviet Union or vice versa during that decade or plus, but we found various mechanisms, so-called confidence-building measures in military lingo, that included the Helsinki Act, included the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, a number of bilateral military-to-military, civilian-to-civilian exchanges of experts and so-called epistemic communities. There's a whole toolbox, folks, that we used with the Soviets, and it stabilized the Cold War at a very dangerous point. Of course, then they had a big change on their side named Gorbachev. That also contributed to a de-escalation of the intensity of the Cold War. But I think we need to go back, open up that old toolbox and say, right, this could work with the Chinese, that could work with the Chinese, and try and stabilize and manage this competition and achieve competitive coexistence, okay? I'll stop on that point. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you very much. So let me transition off stage. Peter?
Yes, thank you.
Over to you.
All right, thank you. A couple of housekeeping items. If you've got your cards and you have questions, there is a basket up here. If you would come up and drop them there. It is now, I've got 10:10. Let's reconvene at 10:40. There will be coffee and cookies outside and to the right, and the alley between Lebanon Opera House and Dutiles. So we'll see you in a half an hour. Thank you all. not working. Hello? There we go. Hello? I'd like to reconvene. It's about 10:41. I forgot one thing. I would like to thank the Dickey Center, the John Sloan Dickey Center at Dartmouth for International Understanding at Dartmouth College for co-hosting the summer lecture series. Is Tom Candon in the audience? There, Tom is way back up in the back corner there. Thank you, Tom. I inadvertently forgot you before. Thank you very much. I am now going to turn the meeting back, or the session back over to Pamela Crossley.
Thank you. Is this on? It is. Okay. So the questions came in really in a huge amount, and I didn't see one that wasn't worth a half hour's discussion. So I'm really very good, and so I've consolidated them a bit and in a thematic way. So some of the original questions may not be completely recognizable. I think there's one we should get out of the way at the beginning. Has this series of lecture speakers been restricted by the Chinese government? I think the answer is no. Is it? Is it no? The answer is no.
Well,
all right, so that was easy. That one didn't take a half
there is
hour.
an answer to it.
There's an answer to
It's
it?
different than no.
Yes?
Yeah. So it's an interesting and somewhat sensitive question, but there's bad news and good news. Bad news is, yes, I have been subjected to an invitation ban by the Chinese government that lasted for 8 years, from 2015 until about 6 weeks ago. And the good news is I'm now out of the penalty box. And I've been invited to visit China at my convenience for professional meetings. Does that mean I will go? Not necessarily, given the conditions there that I outlined in my talk. But I published an article, maybe the questioner knows about that, in the Wall Street Journal, a rather infamous article in 2015 that the Chinese government did not like. And they retaliated, by not allowing me to be invited to getting a visa. You can get a visa any day, a tourist visa, but if you don't have an official invitation, you cannot get an official visa. So it was a special category, an invitation ban. So anyway, the good news is they've seen the error of their ways, and I'm able to go again. Mind you, I did go twice during that 8-year period. For some reason, the made the decision, the memo never got down to a province called Fujian. And I and visits to Xiamen University in Fujian. I have been in since then, and Hong Kong, of course. Why? Because people always want to ask about this question.
Next, we had a sort of cluster of questions about words. So I'll just throw them out, and then you link however you want to, okay? So a couple of people were... closer to the mic. Is this good? So a couple of people, you got their attention when you said so-called Tiananmen massacre. So maybe now just you can think about that for a sec. Some people ask about the Chinese. Do they use the term competition? And if so, what is that word in Chinese? What are the connotations, and so on and so forth? Somebody had said maybe you could say a word about neocolonialism. I thought maybe you could say a word about neo-totalitarianism. So there you go. Words, that's the first question, is little words that came up. Well, the so-called Tiananmen massacre, the Chinese competition says neocolonialism and neo-totalitarianism.
Sure, okay, thank you. Well, the reason I said so-called Tiananmen Massacre is because the massacre did not take place in Tiananmen Square, okay? People were killed somewhere between 600 and 2,000. The estimates range, but all the shootings took place on the adjacent areas to Tiananmen Square, to the west, to the south, to the east. Now, to be fair, yes, some of the troops did fire randomly from the north end of the square when they entered. But the killings took place outside of Tiananmen Square, so maybe it's a semantic difference, but I think it's, it's an empirical fact. Massacre took place, yes, just the question is where it took place. So that's the only reason I use that terminology. Competition in Chinese is 竞争. It has a rather neutral, sports-oriented connotation, I would say. Neo-colonialism, I'm not sure I have a view on that. It's a term that is used in the China field today to describe some of their behavior in the developing world, particularly in Africa. Obviously they're not a colonial power, but some of the dependencies and the investments in resources, into minerals and timbers and gold and other resources, take them out of the ground, out of Africa, back to China, remind people of the colonial period. It reminds Africans, by the way, it's not Westerners who use this term, it's Africans who use this term, and other kind of practices the Chinese exhibit. So some of their third world Belt and Road behavior has been characterized. I'm not sure I would necessarily agree with the terminology. I'm just trying to say that's how the term neo-colonialism is being used with reference to China today. Neo-totalitarianism is my own term. I first used that term in my book, China's Future, which was published in 2016. And I don't know if you read it, Pamela, but in that book I was trying to anticipate, as the title suggests, what is China's future? And I had 4 alternative possibilities, and I had a diagram that was like a British roundabout. And we have roundabouts in this country now too, right? Where you go into the roundabout and get off in a number of different different ways. And so I said China could revert to neoliberalism. Mind you, in 2016, I called China soft authoritarian power. That's where they were throughout the Jiang Zemin and, the Hu Jintao, late Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao period. So I said they could either stay on that path. In fact, so that was one possibility, or I said they could revert back to the neoliberal path of the 1980s that I described in the talk under Deng Xiaoping, which is more open, more liberal, more tolerant than soft authoritarianism. Or they, at that time, 2016, they were just becoming a hard authoritarian state under Xi Jinping's first term. And the signs of various repression were already quite evident. So I argued in that book that that was the trend line. We were moving from soft to hard authoritarianism. But then I thought, conceptually, we have to at least entertain the possibility that it could get worse than hard authoritarianism. And so I threw in a 4th alternative in that book called neo-totalitarianism. Now, totalitarianism is a term, of course, taken from the Soviet Union, from Nazi Germany, primarily. And as I say, in 2016, I said, it's just a conceptual possibility that scholars and analysts had to at least consider things could get worse than was the case then. That's now 7 years ago. Well, I didn't anticipate that happening. What has happened? That's exactly what's happened. They've gone from hard authoritarianism to neo-totalitarianism. And there are all kinds of indicators that characterize a totalitarian state. The neo part is just that it's new, it's now. I mean, you don't have, this is not Stalin's China or Hitler's China. There are things that Hitler and Stalin did that one does not find in contemporary China. There are things that Hitler and Stalin did that are there in contemporary China. Anyway, I think today that's the most appropriate terminology from a political scientist's standpoint for describing the political system and the society, what the political system does to the society. But this is Orwell on steroids, folks, with surveillance technologies and just pervasive intrusion into the civil life of the society and the securitization of everything, as I was saying. So that's a long-winded answer to that fourth question, but that's what now I have to say, just to try and leave this conversation on hopefully an upward note, doesn't mean that this is set in stone. If we've seen anything in post-1949 China, it's been that we've seen all four of those phases: neoliberal, soft authoritarian, hard authoritarian, and neo-totalitarian. And we've seen waves. We've seen the country oscillate through these patterns. The Chinese have a term for it. It's called the Fang Shou Zhouqi. The Fang, the opening, closing cycle. Fang is to open, Shou is to close. Zhouqi is cycle, and it repeats. And we've seen, a number of these, usually from soft, it's like 6 years. Scholars have done this, Richard Baum, the late Richard Baum, and others have studied these cycles. There have been 6 or 7 cycles since 1979, when Deng Xiaoping came to power, of opening. Opening means loosening, liberalism, and then tightening means authoritarian, totalitarianism. Usually it's been about, very precise, 6 years, sometimes 7 of opening, followed by 1 or 2 years of contraction and repression, followed by another burst of 6 years of opening. So the opening phases have been longer than the kind of convulsion, the retraction, the conservative crackdowns that inevitably come. Because in the Chinese leadership, you've got liberals and you've got real Leninist totalitarian leaders, and they're always nipping at the heels of the liberals. So anyway, we've seen that oscillating pattern back and forth for over 30, 40 years now. So just because they're in a neo-totalitarian phase today doesn't mean that it's forever. But frankly, as long as Xi Jinping's in power, it is forever. It's not going to change as long as he's the leader of that country. But there are a lot of people inside the party and in the society who are not at all content with the neo-totalitarian phase. So I'm a China watcher of my entire life. I'm not about to sit here and say this is forever, folks. No, it's going to, if I had to bet, it's going to change. The question is when. And how, I can predict. It would become more soft or more liberal. This Fang Shou cycle would repeat. But this is an anomaly because we are now in year 14. As I said, it was usually 6 years opening, 2 years of contraction. We're now in year 14 of contraction. This is a qualitatively different situation.
Funny you should mention Xi Jinping, and maybe you've already answered this great. We had a little cluster of questions about Xi Jinping, and one of them was from somebody who had read China's leaders from Mao to now, and noted that you had described Xi as a modern emperor. So there were other questions about, how big an obstacle he really is to moving somewhere.
Oh, Pamela, I think you should answer this question. You're much more knowledgeable about Chinese emperors than I. But I thank the person who posed the question for buying and reading my most recent book. I have good news there too. Just this past week, the second revised edition has been published in paperback, just in time for you to order for Christmas. You know, it's never too early. No, there is a second edition, but thank you for reading the first edition. But I look at the 5 leaders that have ruled China since 1949. And I describe, as you indicate, Xi Jinping as a modern emperor. Well, because he rules in methods and ways that was reminiscent of Qing and Ming emperors in particular. Rather, aloof, has a kind of regal, imperial way about him. He issues edicts, as all emperors would do. And then people have to not only obey the edicts, they have to repeat the edicts. There's an ideology there, there's a language, there's a lexicon. So the emperor says X, everybody is supposed to say X. There's fears that in imperial China, here I am sitting next to the leading imperial Chinese historian in the United States, and I'm a little nervous about making this comment, but there was always factionalism within the court. There was always scheming around the emperor. The emperor was never secure because the eunuchs and the concubines and his own imperial household staff would always, at least he would perceive them as being maneuvering around him. So the emperor's always had this kind of paranoia about being overthrown. Well, Xi Jinping is paranoid in spades about being overthrown. And so he's just bludgeoned any apparent opposition. So the use of the security system and surveillance system, not just electronic surveillance, but what used to be the Baojia and Ledyard systems, he's resurrected at the county level and below. There's a number of, read Professor Crossley's books about how imperial emperors acted, and then look at Xi Jinping's behavior. You will find, I think, a lot of similarities, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
There are a lot of similarities, yeah. We can talk about other things later on, but yeah, those are actually very striking, those particular questions. All right, anything else you want to say about Xi Jinping before we get him out of the system? Yes?
Well, look, he's a human being, and he's now, as of June 23rd, I think it is, 70 years old. So he's not going to be there forever. He may be president for life. His longevity as leader is until he either encounters a health issue or he's overthrown. And I'm not going to sit here as a China watcher and say there's no possibility of him not being overthrown. There is. In that system, it's always a possibility. And in authoritarian systems in general. I mean, look what just happened in Russia a couple weeks ago. And look, I'm not predicting it, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there have been coup attempts in China before, communist China. The security services are under very tight control by Xi Jinping. This is something he has paid real attention to. I'm told he swaps out his bodyguards every fortnight. But he's 70 years old, so there are health issues. Can you imagine Xi Jinping on a treadmill or lifting weights or swimming laps? This guy does not look particularly robust physically. I'm no doctor, but we don't know anything about his health. He has been seen on some foreign trips a few years ago to Europe to have a tremor, and some people thought he had premature Parkinson's. All I'm trying to say is we don't know his health, but he's a human being. And his political health, there's a lot of tension in the Chinese system right now. A lot of it in the party and amongst people in the society. I've been visited recently by some Chinese friends. who were very open about the degree of disgruntlement and discontent with Xi Jinping's China. People are not happy. Does that add up to an opposition? No. Discontent does not equal opposition, and opposition does not equal overthrow. But listen, this is a very, it's not, and there's a lot we can't see, you know, especially from across an ocean. So, you know, I'm just saying this is not a permanent condition.
Thank you. We had a series of questions about, let's say, strategic and potentially military flashpoints. Right? There's the South China Sea, there's other parts of Southeast Asia, and now let me link together Taiwan and Cuba. Get it? Okay, so now, what about them?
Well, I don't want to dodge the question, but I want you to come back next week for the second session. I know that the speakers next week are going to address this very question, the flashpoints. So, you know, there will be extended discussion. I mean, you've just named the main ones, Taiwan, South China Sea. I would add East China Sea and the China-India border to that. And there's always North Korea as a potential flashpoint. So China is surrounded by flashpoints. And any of them could flash, no pun intended. You know, and accidents can occur, and intentional aggression can occur. You know, the Chinese in the South China Sea, they claim all of it. They're building these islands. They're militarizing their islands. They're deploying military forces onto those islands. The Southeast Asians contest those islands as theirs, not Chinese, but they can't do anything about it. Their militaries or navies are so weak, they can't do anything about it. The United States can't really do anything about it either, except to run what we call freedom of navigation operations through the South China Sea and close to the islands as a matter of international law and principle, to prove that these are international sea lanes, not a Chinese lake. Right? If you look at the diagram of what the Chinese claim, it's a big, some people call it a cow's tongue. Anyway, the American Navy, and in fact other navies, Australian, Canadian, German, French, British, all 5 of those navies are now sailing with some regularity these freedom of navigation operations. So we're not alone, but we're just trying to make a point that this is not a Chinese lake. Can we do anything about the islands? No. Taiwan is really, you know, such a complicated story, but what we do know is that Xi Jinping has told his military to be ready, quote unquote, to be ready, for military force against Taiwan by the year 2027. He's on record with that. CIA Director William Burns is on record having said he said that. So it's not saying that Xi Jinping says we're going to invade in 2027. He's simply telling his military to be ready in case he gives the order. Well, folks, that's 4 years from now. You know, so no military likes to be in a position of not being ready if their commander-in-chief gives them an order to do something. And there are a number of serious questions about certain elements of the Chinese military on whether they could actually undertake a full naval assault, naval and air assault on the island. So you never know with war until it happens what militaries are or are not capable of. Witness Russia and Ukraine, okay? I was speaking to an American, senior retired American general recently who said that the Chinese, the attempts to take Taiwan militarily would dwarf in many ways Normandy, certainly, D-Day landing, but also, he said, Gulf War I and II in certain dimensions. So this is a highly complex military operation, if they wanted to do that. I don't think they want to do that, and I'm not certain they're capable of a full-on assault. And then, suppose they're successful, what are you going to do with the 24 million people on the island? You know, occupation is not exactly something the Chinese have a lot of experience with, except in the Qing dynasty. Read her book. So there may be some lessons. Which reminds me of when the Americans went into Iraq. The Mongolian ambassador in Washington kept trying to get an appointment with Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, and the Rumsfeld office kept putting him off. You know, what, Mongolian ambassador? We're trying to wage a war halfway around the world. I don't have time to see this man. Finally, the man was very persistent. They scheduled it. He comes in, he says, "Sir, we invaded and occupied Iraq for about 100 years. Maybe you'd like to know a little bit about our experience, our Mongolian experience." It's just, but, you know, the mainland Chinese trying to occupy an island of 24 million people. There's that dimension, counterinsurgency. Then what I was going to mention, blockade. So that's the most, to my mind, the most likely scenario. The Chinese have already signaled that's exactly what they are preparing for. When did they signal it? Right after Nancy Pelosi's visit last summer. And again, recently after Speaker McCarthy met with the Taiwanese president in California. Air, naval, missile blockade. Seal the island off. So what does that mean? That means 1962 Cuba, folks. Think 62 Cuba. Who's going to run the blockade? The American Navy obviously ran the blockade, or no, the American Navy blockaded in 62, so the shoe would be on the other foot. First, the Chinese Navy would have to enforce a blockade 24/7, indefinitely. That's, I'm told by American military, that's very difficult to do. And secondly, the Americans, or a combination of the Americans and some other navies, might run the blockade. So there are several scenarios you have to think about. It's not just a question of landing Chinese paratroopers in downtown Taipei. That's not going to happen first. First, I don't think the Chinese mainland want to use force, but they've signaled that they're increasingly ready, and they're losing their so-called patience with the Taiwanese. And it's a very volatile and very dangerous situation for the United States, because our president has now 4 times publicly said that the United States will defend Taiwan against the use of force by the mainland. So this is a very dangerous, volatile situation. South China Sea, accidents can happen, and they can escalate. As I said, we've had a number of close calls, air, sea, subsurface. East China Sea, that's really a Japan-China issue. Now, Sino-Indian border, that's flared up 2 or 3 times in the last few years, and with loss of life on both sides. So the Chinese are, living in a neighborhood, well, it's there. They are causing some of these tensions themselves, most of these tensions. So, watch that area. Thank you.
And present day Cuba, 2 people asked about this, China in Cuba. Is that a thing?
Well, all I know is what I read in the newspaper about the Chinese monitoring station that's been in Cuba since 2019. But now there are reports that the Chinese and Cuba have signed some sort of agreement for Chinese military forces to come to Cuba and train Cuban soldiers. We don't know, or I don't know, the validity of that report or if it will materialize. But we have a Chinese listening facility that is being upgraded. It's been there for 4 years, folks. It's not new. but it's now apparently being, the radars and the collection capacity is being upgraded so that they can hear and see into the southeastern United States. But of course, we have different means to counter that, electronic means to counter their surveillance. But Cuba's a sovereign country, right? They invite China or Russia or anybody else into their territory, set up a monitoring facility. Well, this is not circa 1962. They're not putting ballistic missiles in Cuba that could reach the continental United States. But, you know, there's obvious, this is new. And this is, you know, this is what I would say is get used to it, folks. We're going to see this increasingly. I don't like it, but the Chinese have gone global. We are going to see their naval, intelligence, and even Air Force begin to deploy in various parts of the world, including this hemisphere. They've got some facilities in Tierra del Fuego down in Argentina right now. They've got increasing military-to-military relations with a number of South American countries, in addition to Cuba. This is very disconcerting, very disconcerting. But those are sovereign countries, and they can make their own decisions.
So maybe we can close out with, there was a cluster of questions that were, again, very, very acute, that I think more or less linked U.S. politics, including competition, even competition in China bashing between the parties, ways in which U.S. politics or U.S. commercial interests could in some way turn provocative and perhaps even result in war, just coming out of one of these two sectors, politics or commerce. It's sort of generated on the American side. Is that, you get the idea?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the one thing I would encourage you New Hampshireites to do is ask every single presidential candidate who comes up here over the next year plus, what is their China policy? Explain their China policy in detail. What are the assumptions underlying it? And don't let them get away with platitudes. You know, they've all got their platitudes, but try and dig down. Because this is the, other than Russia, this is the most major challenge the United States faces in a variety of spheres, not just in the ones we've talked about today, but in microchips and a lot of ways. So all of these candidates who are coming up here, you know, they need to articulate with some degree of clarity and logic what their policies are, not just throw away bumper sticker, you know, election things. Now, Nikki Haley, I love it. Actually, I think she has articulated a China policy so far in much greater detail than any of the other candidates. And she uses the term communist China. I love it. That's what I love about it. It's a real throwback to the Cold War. She's used it intentionally ever since she announced her run for the presidency. But she gave a speech a week ago or so at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. You can watch online, and you should watch it. So when she comes up here, ask her about it. Ask her to explain. I mean, she's got some answers. I don't know if DeSantis even knows where China is on a map, but he doesn't have any answers. Trump, of course, he's got his views, but he needs to update and explain what he would do with China today and all the rest of them. So put their feet to the fire. I'm serious. You are in a unique position in this country. Don't let them get away with fudging and this issue. And you know, so what was there anything beyond that?
That is provocative influence coming that could lead to a war, and there was actually a question about nuclear war.
Well, your speaker next week is an expert on Chinese nuclear capabilities. I'm going to leave it to him. He's a mystery guest. I'm not going to tell you yet who he is. But if I understand the question, could commercial conflict result in war? I don't think so. It has certainly contributed to the tensions between the two countries. It's complicated. On the one hand, we do $900 billion, that's with a B, in trade with the People's Republic of China, our third largest trading partner. But this is very significant amounts of trade. Despite all the frictions that we've spoken about here this morning, our American corporates are still deeply embedded in China. Our farmers, a lot of that trade is agriculture, exports. Soybeans in particular, but wheat and other things. I grew up in a farm in Illinois. I was just talking to a colleague of mine a couple days ago. So, the American agricultural community is very dependent on exports to China. Other companies, though, are reducing their footprints. The Xi Jinping regime, as part of neo-totalitarianism, they are making it very difficult for companies to operate there in a number of ways, and this recent counter-espionage law is one of those ways. So a lot of companies have been practicing what they call the China Plus strategy for several years. China Plus means you have one foot in China, because it's just too big a market. They've sunk 4 decades worth of investment into the country, and they can't just pull out, but they're very nervous, and their other foot is now increasingly elsewhere. Indonesia, Vietnam, India, Mexico, and other countries. So the American business community has figured this out 3-4 years ago, but with the tensions over Taiwan, this new counter-espionage law, the arrests of American business people over the last couple of months in China, they are getting very, very, very nervous, the American corporate community, to my understanding. So could it lead to a war? No, I don't think so, but it's just another fraught element of our relationship. Should they be diversifying their supply chains? Absolutely. And should they be lowering their footprint? Well, if they can find an alternative in Indonesia, Vietnam, India, Mexico, absolutely. Get the heck out of there. It's a risky operating environment, if not dangerous. Again, there are people who know more about this than I do. The U.S.-China Business Council and their president, Craig Allen, will talk at some length about this issue. But, I think it's a fraught element. And if that piece of the U.S.-China puzzle is no longer reliable as ballast to the relationship, then we're really in trouble, right? Because it's the trade, it's the $900 billion of trade that has, and the American business community as a political lobby in this country that has kept the relationship, from completely falling through the floor. So if the American business community is they're already nervous, but if they're going to start pulling out and they're going to stop lobbying Congress for cooperative relations with China, then this is even more of what I was trying to describe in my comments this morning. This is a dangerous situation.
Well, okay, we had 2 questions that related to what I would say are intermediate powers, and maybe with some kind of even the possibility of definitive influence over the U.S.-China relationship, and those were the EU and India.
Excellent questions, thank you. I've spent a good deal of my professional career watching Europe-China relations because I once lived and taught there, and I've had a long-standing interest. So, the European-China relationship had grown, past tense, very close and very integrated economically. This is a relationship that was driven entirely by commerce. The Europeans don't have some of the problematic areas with China that the Americans do. There is no Taiwan problem for Europe. There are no European military forces deployed in East Asia around China their national security interests are very different from the United States. So that has left the Europeans to pursue essentially a commercial and cultural relationship with China, which was going very well until about 5, 6, 7 years ago. And it has come off the rails. The Europeans have increasing number of difficulties, which we don't have time to go into, but they are more on the same page with the Americans now than ever before. And I've been watching transatlantic China policy for 4 decades. I've never seen it closer and tighter, and that's good. We need Europe, and vice versa, and we need a number of partners around the world in our dealings with China. We can't go it alone. And to the extent that the United States and other countries in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, in the Middle East have difficulties with China, and we can find synergies, fine, let's do it. So believe me, a lot of countries, the big mega trend in the world is that, it's the way I started off with my Pew poll this morning. Everybody's having difficulties with China, everybody. Save a few African countries and 1 or 2 Southeast Asian countries. So that's the big trend. The problem is China. You know, they want to change their behavior, then they will bring other countries back into their orbit. But their behavior has just been pushing everybody away. So that means everybody else can find synergies with each other, you know, to deal together with China. That's the only way to deal with China, is in a coalition, whether it's in the economic realm or in other spheres. So Europe, that's Europe. China-India relations are not terribly good. As I mentioned, they've had 3 military clashes on their mutual contested border. It's the only border that China has with any of its 17 neighbors that has not been demarcated and agreed. And there's been loss of life. The Indians don't trust China at all. And I'm not sure the Chinese trust India at all. But now what we're seeing, or the Indians are seeing, is the Chinese Navy, in particular, moving into their space, into the Indian Ocean, and they've already built a base in East Africa, and their ships and submarines go back and forth throughout the Indian Ocean, which the Indians think of as their natural geographic sphere of influence. So that's one problem. The other problem is the countries around India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. These are all countries that China has cultivated and built commercial and military relations with. So the Indians are feeling encircled by the Chinese. So when I stop there, we've got 5 minutes, maybe 1 or 2 last questions.
Well, we got a 5-minute warning, did we? And do we have 3 minutes left? 3 minutes. How about the Belt and Road? How's that going?
Okay, thank you. So maybe we should explain. Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, is a really extraordinary international initiative by China, launched in 2009, I think, 10, thereabouts, 11. So it's been going on for the last 12 years. It's the Chinese equivalent of the Marshall Plan. That's not even a good analogy, but they are trying to build a belt across Central Asia from China to Europe, and a maritime road, which is a contradiction in terms. They got their branding wrong from the beginning. The road should have gone overland, and the belt should have gone across water, but for whatever reason, the Maritime Silk Road, they call it, runs down through Southeast Asia. I wrote a book about this recently, and and then it goes all the way to Europe. So this is basically a mega initiative to connect China to Europe. commercially. But other countries can join, African countries, Middle Eastern countries, even Latin American countries. So it's open to everybody, the Chinese claim. It's basically an infrastructure initiative, hard infrastructure, ports, rails, mines, buildings, digital. But there are cultural and public health components to it. It's a pretty impressive, it's a very impressive initiative by China. But you ask, how's it going? It's not so well. Part of it has to do with COVID. Now, you can't blame the not so well part just on COVID, but COVID interrupted a lot of the activities that the Chinese had embarked on. And in the interim, China's behavior in these other realms that we've been talking about has caused the other countries, the partner countries, to increase their concerns about China. So many of these countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, are re-examining some of their previous commitments. Some of them, like Malaysia, has pulled out of a number of them. They're renegotiating others. Then there's labor issues. The Chinese will come in and build the infrastructure with their own labor. Therefore, the recipient country doesn't get to participate physically in the building of their port or whatever. They resent that. That's neo-colonial, they argue. Then there's the debt issue. This is a bit overblown, but certain countries, Sri Lanka and others, have fallen deep into debt that they cannot repay as a result of these projects. There's environmental concerns that come with a lot of these projects. And so the jury is out. I guess the answer to the question about how Belt and Road is going is it's not going super well and it's not going super badly. The jury is still out. But the Chinese are, they're beavering away at it, and we'll see how it goes.
That gets it. I think we are so grateful to you for coming.
I'd like to thank Professor Shambaugh and Crossley for a very informative hour of our time. This is the first of the summer lecture series, 6 sessions. I think Professor Shambaugh has given us a great framework for thinking about the rest of the issues, the rest of the lectures in the coming 5 weeks. So thank you again, once again. Thank you for being here. And I would also like to remind everybody that there is a post-lecture discussion that will go on in classroom 3A at 1 Court Street, which is just around the corner, which is the main office of OSHER at Dartmouth. Thank you all for being here today.